Google the finance curse and look for the images, you'll see a black griffin on a red background. That's the e-book that we've published. The Post of the Remembrancer goes back to the 16th century. I think it's 1571. It was created in 1571. And the real job of the Remembrancer is to act as the City of London's messenger to anyone who holds power in Britain, or who thinks they hold power. The real power lies with the City of London, not with the monarchy and not with Parliament. And they're there in Parliament just to make that not very subtle reminder: we hold power, you don't. That's the sad thing. We in Britain think that we have sovereignty and democracy. We don't ourselves, and it's very, very sad. And things have certainly worsened in the last 20 years, as by and large political parties have simply thrown up their hands and surrendered to the power of the City of London. Up there's a book, one of E.P. Thompson's books, Customs in Common, where he talks about the whole processes where men could take their wives to market, and this continued right into the 19th century, to take their wives to market and sell them as chattel. And this happened quite regularly.
So you were no longer married? You passed them on?
You passed them on.
Just back to the Remembrancer, do you know anywhere there's a lot of writing about the Remembrancer?
Well, in Treasure Islands, for start.
Treasure Island, yeah, sure,
we
yeah.
certainly mentioned the Remembrancer book jointly as well.
Which will be called? You don't know?
Well, we haven't decided yet. We're thinking about calling it Capital's Capital, but we're not sure yet. We wanted a journalist's story, because we knew that it needed to be made much more interesting and would be much more based around interviews with people. So Nick and I spent 5 years going around the world interviewing people for that book. But more importantly, that book has really changed the kind of people's attitudes.
Yeah, that Griffin chapter is really important. It's practically a standalone chapter in the book, isn't it?
Well, there are a lot of things from the Griffin chapter which we wanted to include in the Griffin chapter, which the publishers said, look, that's a separate book. And some of it ended up as this book here, which is much more theoretical.
Right.
But that's a really powerful argument, actually, when you start looking at it, because what the City of London has argued for decades is that they say where would Britain be without the City of London? If you go back to the 1930s, after the 1929 crash, which, like the current economic crisis, took a long time to feed out into the real economy, they set up a committee of inquiry, a commission of inquiry called the Macmillan Commission, nothing to do with Harold. This is
UK thing.
In the UK. And that committee of inquiry largely came to the conclusion that the City of London is totally detached from the rest of our economy and actually is quite harmful to the rest of the economy. And I think that's core to my argument. And core to my argument is that far from being an asset to the UK economy, British bankers know diddly squit about domestic banking and lending policy to particularly industrial productive capitalism. They are much more geared towards financial capitalism and speculation. So they are all about, they call themselves the wealth creators, but in fact they are the wealth extractors. Yeah. They are what economists call rent seekers. This is one of the reasons why we have a legitimate criticism to make of financial journalists. I've mentioned the BBC several times in the discussion there. The quality of their financial journalism and economics journalism is rock bottom, shockingly bad. Whether it's the Today programme, Newsnight for a while had Paul Mason, and he was an excellent economist and he asked excellent questions, but he's moved on. Robert Peston, frankly, doesn't know what he's talking about. I mean, he has no idea about critical economics and so on. He parrots lines, and I think by and large the BBC is culpable of deluding the British population about the importance of the City of London. But the BBC regularly gets beaten up for its left-wing bias. Well, I mean, let's get serious. The BBC's left-wing bias is a myth. The BBC is very much part of the broader establishment, to use Owen Jones' term.
So this economic, I mean, you said the 29 crash, was it? That took a while to filter through. So, I mean, as the recent one 2008 was it or something? That hasn't filtered through fully.
I think the implications of it and the responses, particularly the austerity responses, have yet to filter through. But what's happened, and this is where I think Naomi Klein's shock doctrine is so important, is that it's been used as the means to push forward not only with deeper austerity and cutting back on the welfare state, but a whole raft of measures which the City of London has been pushing for: deeper privatisation, more corporate subsidies, this, that, and the other. I mean, we now have an estimate of 85 billion a year of the cost of corporate subsidies. That's corporate welfare, and that comes from endless lobbying in a variety of different forms. I mean, direct subsidies from local government authorities to support indirect subsidies, corporate tax avoidance, all of these things at a massive cost. And
what about tax credits? Because I'm thinking, a lot of people now today, they've got full-time jobs, but they're on benefits, they're on tax credits. So Absolutely. Is that not the state subsidising these corporations?
Well, that's possibly one of the biggest overall costs. If we look at what's been happening in the housing markets for the last few decades, is a transfer of people out of state housing into private landlord-owned housing. The cost of housing benefits has risen through the roof. Now, who are the main beneficiaries here? Not unemployed people, but employed people working at sometimes below minimum wage or minimum wage, who cannot afford, on the basis of their earnings, to pay the rents they're having to pay the private landlords, and so the landlords are being subsidised with, truly extortionate housing benefit bill, and that's rising, and it's rising very, very fast at the moment. To be honest, we'd be far better off if there was state expenditure in investing in low-cost, affordable rental, state-owned accommodation or cooperatively owned accommodation.
Just to come back to the BBC, I've met the business unit people, and for me that the business unit itself is very close to big business. Do you have any experiences like that? I mean, I've met John Zilker, who heads it up, who I believe is from a Middle East banking family, and Simon Jack, who spent his summer, I noticed, in Bermuda, in a tax haven. I mean, these are the main, these are key voices, isn't it? Hugh Pym I've met several times. I think he's now the health economics reporter, and considering what's going on in the NHS, I think he's missing a hell of a lot of what he could be reporting on. He's from
I've had a lot of experience, and the number of times the BBC's been filming here, the BBC Panorama and others programmes have filmed in this room, and talking about tax havens or talking about Britain's industrial development strategy, and at the minute you start talking critically, for example, along the lines of let's unravel what we mean by creating a tax competitive environment. The cameras switch off, we can't go there. The number of BBC television programmes I've recorded interviews for, which have never made it, is indicative of this. But I think part of the BBC's problem is that for many decades they've been beaten up by very, very powerful business lobbies and described as anti-business, and we ourselves, I've been described as anti-business. Well, actually, I've been a company director on many occasions. I'm a company director at the moment, and very entrepreneurial. This is not an anti-business agenda, but they think that anybody who talks critically about corporate tax avoidance, for example, or about taking a contrary position to the idea that we have to give companies tax breaks or cut regulation in this country, is immediately labelled as anti-business. And I think the BBC has somehow lost its courage along the way. It's been beaten up as anti-business to such an extent that it has to parrot the business line. It's not just the BBC, the Labour Party is the same, and the number of Labour Party politicians who are scared stiff of talking about these issues for fear of the party becoming labelled as anti-business. They don't dare talk about tax evasion or tax avoidance precisely because they then get taxed as being anti-business. A terrible media bias in this country. Most of the red tops and most of the newspapers are owned by people who themselves are based in tax havens and pay no tax. So there's that side of it as well. But you also have extremely powerful business lobbies, the Chamber of Commerce, the British, the Institute of Directors, the Confederation of British Industries are constantly whining on about we need to have deregulation, we need to have lower taxes on business, we must create a competitive environment for business. And by that they mean roll back any attempt to regulate business, no matter how necessary the regulation is, and any attempt to tax business. And this is shocking because the case for business, for allowing businesses to operate in countries, precisely because we allow the creation of businesses, we allow them to operate in this, because we regard this as the best way of advancing our social interests and our economic interests. But they somehow seem to detach themselves from any sense of obligation to our society and think that paying tax is harmful. It isn't. We need those tax revenues for education and health and other services, and companies that don't contribute to it are essentially free riders.
Yeah. And if those companies that have been is it avoiding tax or evading?
There's no difference. They try to pretend there's a big distinction. They don't pay tax, so the rest of us suckers have to pay tax.
If those companies did pay a similar level of tax to the normal individual, how much money would that put into the economy? Or
well, actually, we, that is the Tax Justice Network, have been quite successful in countering tax avoidance, but we're still talking about billions a year, so the sums involved are massive. The sums involved in tax evasion, the absolutely illegal, in your face, illegal not payment of tax, are enormous. They run to many tens of billions of revenue. The trouble with Britain is we've created a very permissive culture where we think it's okay to pay the plumber cash in hand, and plain white van man does business below the counter outside the tax thing. And most people think that's okay. We've got one over the government. Actually, it's not okay. It means that kids aren't getting proper schooling, elderly people aren't getting decent pensions, sick people aren't getting decent health services, and our infrastructure's crumbling. So actually, by and large, we're much worse off as a result.
Yeah. On another subject, David Southwell, I think, suggested that that London was the money laundering capital of the world. Would you say that's true? Or?
Yeah, undoubtedly. You can talk to any money laundering expert around the world, and I've spent most of the last 30 years doing exactly that. And they all say that London is the destination of choice for money coming out of the Middle East, out of Africa, out of Latin America. And the truth of the matter is that London is the world's biggest capital market. It's serviced by lots of tax havens like Jersey, Guernsey, Isle of Man, Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, which don't ask any questions about the source, the origin of the money. And by and large, I regret to say that British governments, since more or less the end of empire, have been running a current account deficit and a trade deficit. And they've had to pay for that deficit. And they've had to pay for that deficit by attracting money from around the world. And by and large, they haven't asked too many questions about where that money's come from. Was it Russian money, Ukrainian money, Chinese money? The City of London busy lobbying in China so that the City of London becomes the first world trading centre for offshore renminbi. And why? Because they're desperate to attract the money. The Global Financial Integrity talks about as much as $1 trillion a year of dirty money being laundered through the financial system as a whole, and one can assume that London attracts a very, very large proportion of that money. $1 trillion of money is a fair amount of cash.
And have the Justice Network found ways of trying to rectify the situation, and what have they been doing? Are there legal avenues or other avenues people can pursue?
Yeah, and I think first of all we must recognise the scale of this economy, the scale of this black economy is massive, and the power of the lobbies we're up against. There is no richer and more powerful lobby than the rich and powerful, and they are the people we're dealing with. So having made that obvious truism clear, there's a lot that we can do, and first of all, much of this dirty activity happens in conditions of deep secrecy. And that's where the tax havens come in. We tend to call the Tax Justice Network, calls them secrecy jurisdictions, because their main product what they're selling on the international markets is secrecy. Offshore companies which don't reveal who owns them, offshore trusts which reveal nothing about their existence, banking secrecy, not sharing information across borders so that, let's say, an English person who wants to evade tax can set up a Jersey-based trust and hold their money in Switzerland and evade paying taxes on it. All of this happens in conditions of deep secrecy. So what the Tax Justice Network has been pushing for is corporate transparency through country-by-country reporting, which will help us, at the very least, understand where corporations are shifting their profits to tax havens. We're pushing for stronger information exchange between countries. You can't have globalized capital markets and national tax systems without effective cooperation between national governments, so they can share information and track tax evaders. We've seen some success there. We're pushing for measures to require tax havens to reveal who owns these offshore companies, who are the real owners, not the nominees, but who are the real warm-blooded people behind them. We're pushing for information to be revealed about the existence of trusts, who created the trusts, who operates the trusts, and who benefits from the trusts. Because the big game here is to hide your identity behind offshore trusts and offshore foundations. Well, we've had some success here. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, has made strong commitments to work in this area. We need to hold his feet to the fire to make sure he delivers on these commitments, because even if he leaves one little loophole in any of these processes, that loophole will undermine all the rest. And at the moment, the big loophole, the glaring loophole in what's being proposed to G20 lies with the use and abuse of trusts. And of course, trusts are a particularly secretive Anglo-Saxon legal arrangement. And that's where they're trying to avoid us paying any attention. So what can the public do? Deluge number 10 with letters saying, David Cameron, please ensure that any information exchange processes require information to be exchanged about who's behind the trusts, and that all disclosure of who owns companies goes beyond, looks through the trusts and looks to who are the settlors and the beneficiaries of trusts. And finally, Prime Minister, please ensure that country-by-country reporting covers all sectors, all countries, and that developing countries, the poorer countries of the world, benefit from this as much as the richer countries. Focus is on the G20, but next month's will be on the whole issue of corporate welfare. I mentioned that figure of 85 billion. That comes from research out of the University of York, so we've interviewed the team behind that.
Sorry, what was the thing that you said I should look at again?
The tax cast. Just Google tax cast.